Hello, and welcome to another gentle descent into the past. Tonight, we'll open the doors to a world once lost, now rediscovered through quiet storytelling. Perhaps you're lying still beneath the covers, or letting the last hours of the day melt away. Either way, I'm honoured to have you here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Are we continents apart, or just a few time zones away, both listening as the stars come out? If you enjoy resting to soft-spoken tales and thoughtful history, be sure to subscribe. There's so much more to uncover together. This isn't some nightmare or horror story. This is Gin Alley. This is London in the grip of the most devastating addiction crisis the world had ever seen. And by the end of this video, you'll understand how an entire city descended into madness, how gin became cheaper than bread, and how mothers literally sold their own children for one more drink. But first, let me tell you about Mary Jenkins. She was 23 years old, married to a carpenter named Thomas, and mother to 2 young children. Just 5 years earlier, she had been respectable, even prosperous by working-class standards. Thomas earned good money. They had a small but clean home in Spitalfields, and Mary took pride in keeping her children well fed and properly dressed. Then gin arrived in her neighbourhood, and everything changed. Mary's story isn't unique. In fact, it's heartbreakingly common, because what I'm about to show you isn't just history. It's a blueprint for how an entire society can collapse under the weight of addiction, and the parallels to today will shock you. Let me paint you a picture of London before the gin craze took hold. This is 1689, the year William of Orange takes the English throne. London is bustling, dirty, crowded, but alive with possibility. The population has swelled to over 500,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in Europe. Trade is booming, the middle class is growing, and for the first time in centuries, ordinary people have disposable income. The working classes drink, of course they do. Beer is safer than water, wine is for special occasions, and brandy, well, brandy is for the wealthy. The average Londoner consumes about a gallon of beer per day, and this isn't considered excessive. It's nutrition, hydration, and mild intoxication, all rolled into one. But then something happens that will transform not just drinking habits, but the very fabric of English society. King William declares war on France, and overnight, French brandy becomes the enemy. Import duties skyrocket, making brandy prohibitively expensive. The government needs an alternative, something to replace the French spirits that have become unaffordable. Enter gin, or as it was originally known, Geneva, from the Dutch word Geneva. Dutch soldiers had been drinking it for decades, calling it Dutch courage before battle. When William of Orange brought his Dutch supporters to England, they brought their national drink with them. But here's where it gets interesting. The English government doesn't just tolerate gin, they actively encourage it. Picture this policy decision being made in some smoky room in Westminster. The logic seems sound at the time. Gin is made from English grain, supporting local farmers. It's distilled by English workers, creating jobs. It generates tax revenue. And most importantly, it's not French. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, as it turns out. But the politicians of 1690 couldn't have foreseen what was coming. They were thinking about economics and patriotism, not public health. The concept of addiction as a medical condition wouldn't exist for another 2 centuries. The Distilling Act of 1690 removes virtually all restrictions on gin production. Anyone can set up a still. Anyone can sell gin. There are no licenses required, no quality controls, no limits on where or when it can be sold. Within months, gin shops spring up like mushrooms after rain. Not just dedicated gin shops, but grocers, barbers, chandlers, even street vendors start selling gin from wheelbarrows and makeshift stalls. And here's the crucial detail that changes everything. Gin is cheap. Incredibly, impossibly cheap. A quartern of gin, enough to get thoroughly drunk, costs just 4 pence. To put that in perspective, a loaf of bread costs 6 pence. A pint of beer costs 3 pence. For the first time in human history, the urban poor have access to high-proof alcohol that costs less than food. Let me introduce you to Samuel Johnson, not the famous writer, but a different Samuel Johnson, a dock worker in Wapping. He earns about 12 shillings a week when work is available, which isn't always. His wife Sarah takes in washing to supplement their income. They have 3 children under the age of 10 living in a single room that costs them 2 shillings a week in rent. Samuel discovers gin in 1695. At first, it's just a drink after work, something to wash away the ache in his back from loading ships all day. Gin doesn't just numb the pain, it makes him forget the cramped room, the crying children, the constant worry about money. For a few hours, Samuel feels powerful, invincible, free from the grinding poverty that defines his existence. But gin is different from beer. Beer makes you sleepy, full, content. Gin makes you wild. It's 40% alcohol, compared to beer's 3 or 4%. The human body isn't equipped to process this much alcohol this quickly. Samuel doesn't understand pharmacology, but he knows that gin makes him feel things beer never could. Within 6 months, Samuel is drinking gin every day. Not just after work, but before work, during his lunch break, sometimes instead of eating lunch entirely. Sarah notices the change first. Samuel becomes unpredictable, prone to violent mood swings. One moment he's laughing and singing, the next he's throwing furniture and screaming at the children. But here's what makes the gin crisis different from other addiction epidemics. It's not happening in isolation. Samuel's story is being repeated in thousands of homes across London. His neighbour Tom is drinking gin. His supervisor at the docks is drinking gin. The woman who sells him bread is drinking gin. Even his 10-year-old son has started sneaking sips from abandoned bottles in the street. This is 1700 now, just 10 years after the Distilling Act, and London is transforming before everyone's eyes. The changes are visible, measurable, terrifying. Parish records show a dramatic increase in deaths. Births are declining. Crime rates are soaring. But most shocking of all, the social fabric that holds communities together is simply dissolving. Walk down Drury Lane in 1700, and you'll see things that would have been unimaginable just a decade earlier, young as 8. Children selling as gin from baskets. Pregnant women drinking themselves into unconsciousness in broad daylight. Entire families huddled in doorways, too drunk to work, too poor to eat, caught in a cycle that seems impossible to break. The gin isn't just cheap, it's everywhere, and it's getting stronger. Unscrupulous distillers are adding industrial alcohol to increase potency. They're mixing in turpentine, sulfuric acid, even human urine to stretch their supplies. Quality control doesn't exist. Safety regulations are non-existent. The only requirement is that the liquid be strong enough to get people drunk. Mother Emma Coates discovers this the hard way. She's 35 years old, mother of 4, trying to support her family after her husband died in a construction accident. Emma starts selling gin from her front room to make ends meet. She buys it cheap from a distiller in Suffolk, waters it down slightly, and sells it for a small profit. But Emma becomes her own best customer. The gin helps her cope with grief, with poverty, with the overwhelming responsibility of raising 4 children alone. She tells herself she's just taking a small sip to steady her nerves, just enough to get through the day, just enough to sleep at night despite the crying and the hunger and the fear. By 1705, Emma is drinking more gin than she's selling. Her children, ranging in age from 12 down to 4, are essentially raising themselves. The 12-year-old little William has learned to count money and make change. He runs the gin shop while Emma lies unconscious upstairs. The 4-year-old Mary has learned that when Mama won't wake up, she can suck on rags soaked in gin to stop feeling hungry. This scene is repeating itself in thousands of homes across London. children caring for gin-soaked parents, parents selling everything they own, including their children's clothes, to buy more gin, families disintegrating as addiction consumes every relationship, every responsibility, every human connection. The authorities are starting to notice, but they're not sure what they're seeing. Parish officials report bizarre incidents that don't fit any previous category of social problem. A mother found dead in her bed, her infant child nearly starved beside her while dozens of empty gin bottles filled the room. A man who sold his wife's wedding ring, then his tools, then his furniture, and finally his own children's shoes to buy gin. These aren't isolated incidents anymore. They're becoming normal. And the most disturbing part is how quickly normal people, respectable people, people with families and jobs and futures are falling into this nightmare. But we're still early in this story. Because what you've seen so far, as horrifying as it is just the beginning. The gin craze is about to get much, much worse. The government policies that seemed so reasonable in 1690 are about to unleash consequences that no one could have predicted. And the human cost is about to become almost incomprehensible. Because by 1710, something truly sinister is happening to London's children. And this is where Mary Jenkins' story becomes almost too horrific to tell. Remember Mary, the carpenter's wife from Spitalfields? 5 years have passed since gin first appeared in her neighbourhood, and Mary is no longer the woman she once was. Her husband Thomas still goes to work most days, but his hands shake so badly from gin withdrawal that he can barely hold his tools. Their income has dropped to almost nothing, but it's what Mary does next that shows just how completely gin has destroyed the moral foundation of English society. Because Mary Jenkins, this mother who once took pride in dressing her children properly, who once kept a clean home and cooked proper meals, Mary Jenkins sells her youngest child to a gin seller for 2 shillings. Let me repeat that. She sells her own child for gin money. The child is 18 months old, barely walking, still nursing. Mary tells herself it's temporary, that she'll buy down. She knows the hymn back when Thomas gets steady work again. But deep truth, she needs gin more than she needs her son. The physical craving, the mental anguish when she tries to stop, it's unbearable. The child is just crying constantly anyway, demanding food they don't have, attention she can't give. The gin seller, a woman named Ruth Blackwood, who runs a shop on Dorset Street, doesn't want the child either. But she knows she can use him. Babies are good for business. Nothing tugs at heartstrings like a crying infant. Customers feel sorry for Ruth, think she's caring for an orphan, buy an extra quartern of gin out of sympathy. When the baby stops being useful, when he gets sick from malnutrition and gin-soaked rags used to quiet his crying, Ruth simply puts him outside. He's found 3 days later in a doorway, dead from exposure and starvation. The parish burial records list him simply as unknown child aged about 2 years. Mary never asks what happened to her son. She doesn't want to know, because knowing would mean facing what she's become, and facing reality is exactly what gin helps her avoid. This story, this specific horrific transaction, isn't unique. Parish records from across London document hundreds of similar cases. Children sold for gin money, infants abandoned when parents choose alcohol over responsibility, families literally dissolving as gin consumption reaches levels that defy belief. But here's what makes this crisis different from anything before or since. It's not just affecting the very poor anymore. Gin is climbing the social ladder, destroying lives across every level of London society. Meet Jonathan Hartwell, a successful silversmith in Cheapside. In 1705, Jonathan employs 6 apprentices, owns his shop, and lives comfortably with his wife Eleanor and their 3 daughters. The Hartwells attend church regularly, host dinner parties, consider themselves respectable members of London's growing merchant class. Jonathan first tries gin at a business dinner in 1708. A colleague brings a bottle of the finest Geneva, imported directly from Holland, nothing like the rough spirits sold in the slums. It's smooth, sophisticated, and Jonathan finds it helps him relax after long days hunched over delicate metalwork. Within a year, Jonathan is drinking gin daily. Not the rough stuff from street vendors, but expensive, high-quality gin that he tells himself is different, better, safer. He's not like those wretches in Gin Alley. He's a gentleman who enjoys fine spirits in moderation, but gin doesn't recognize class distinctions. The alcohol content is the same, whether the bottle costs 6 pence or 6 shillings, and Jonathan's tolerance builds just as quickly as any dock workers or street sweepers. By 1710, Jonathan is drinking gin in his workshop. His hands, once steady enough to engrave the finest details on silver plate, shake uncontrollably without alcohol. His work becomes sloppy, then dangerous. He burns himself repeatedly with hot metal, cuts himself with sharp tools, ruins expensive commissioned pieces. Eleanor watches her husband transform from a careful craftsman into someone she doesn't recognize. Jonathan becomes secretive, lying about how much he drinks, hiding bottles around the workshop and house. He starts selling their possessions, claiming business is slow, using the money to buy increasingly large quantities of gin. The apprentices notice first. Master Hartwell's breath reeks of gin by 9 in the morning. He gives contradictory instructions, forgets conversations from the previous day, sometimes passes out at his workbench. The quality of work coming from the Hartwell workshop plummets, and customers begin taking their business elsewhere. But Jonathan can't stop. He's tried, many times. He'll go a day, maybe 2, without gin, and the withdrawal is agonizing. His entire body shakes. He sweats profusely, sees things that aren't there, hears voices calling his name. The only relief comes from gin, and the relief is immediate and complete. By 1712, Jonathan has lost his business, his home, and his family. Eleanor has taken their daughters and moved in with her brother, unable to watch Jonathan destroy himself any longer. Jonathan lives in a single room above a gin shop in Whitechapel, supporting his addiction by doing occasional repair work for other gin sellers. The silversmith who once created beautiful objects for London's wealthy now spends his days in a haze of alcohol, surrounded by the very people he once looked down upon. Class distinctions mean nothing in Gin Alley. Addiction is the great equalizer, and Jonathan's story is repeating itself across London's professional classes. Lawyers drinking themselves out of practice, physicians too drunk to treat patients, clergymen giving sermons while visibly intoxicated. The gin crisis isn't just destroying the poor anymore, it's hollowing out the entire social structure. By 1715, London is producing nearly 20 million gallons of gin per year. 20 million gallons for a population of just over 600,000 people. That's roughly 33 gallons per person per year, including children and infants. And this doesn't count beer, wine, or other alcoholic beverages. To put this in perspective, modern Americans consume about 2.5 gallons of spirits per person per year. Londoners in 1715 are consuming more than 13 times that amount. The scale of consumption is literally unprecedented in human history. Walk through any neighbourhood in London and the evidence is everywhere. Gin shops outnumber bakeries 3 to 1. Children as young as 5 stumble through the streets, openly drunk. Pregnant women line up outside distilleries, waiting for the daily production to be ready for sale. The Reverend Thomas Wilson, writing from his parish in St. Botolph's, documents scenes that read like something from Dante's Inferno. Entire families living in single rooms, surrounded by empty gin bottles, too drunk to work or care for themselves. Children caring for gin-soaked parents, begging for food while their mothers lie unconscious. Dead bodies left in the streets because no one is sober enough to arrange burial. But perhaps most disturbing are Wilson's accounts of what gin is doing to London's women. Because while men have always had access to alcohol, gin represents something entirely new for women. It's cheap enough for even the poorest woman to afford. It's available everywhere, sold by other women, consumed openly without social stigma in gin shops that cater specifically to female customers. And women are embracing gin with a desperation that shocks even hardened observers. Meet Catherine Murphy, a 28-year-old seamstress living in Seven Dials. Catherine works piece rate, sewing shirts for a clothing manufacturer, earning just enough to rent a corner of a room shared with 3 other women. The work is tedious, repetitive, done by candlelight in conditions that strain her eyes and cramp her hands. Gin makes the work bearable. A small sip in the morning steadies her hands. A drink at midday numbs the pain in her back from hunching over fabric. An evening gin helps her sleep despite the noise and crowding and constant worry about money. But Catherine discovers something else about gin, something that makes it especially appealing to women trapped in grinding poverty, with no hope of escape. Gin doesn't just numb physical pain and emotional distress. It makes her feel powerful, attractive, important. When Catherine drinks gin, she can forget that she's 28 years old, with no prospects of marriage, no family, no future beyond endless days of sewing shirts for pennies. Gin transforms her from an invisible working woman into someone who matters, someone who can laugh loudly, speak boldly, demand attention. The gin shops understand this psychology perfectly. They're designed specifically to appeal to women like Catherine. Unlike traditional taverns, which are male-dominated spaces where women are barely tolerated, gin shops welcome female customers. They're brightly lit, relatively clean, often run by women for women. Some gin shops offer additional services that traditional taverns don't provide. They serve as informal employment agencies, where women can find piecework or temporary jobs. They function as social centres, where women can gossip, share information, escape temporarily from the isolation of poverty. But most importantly, gin shops offer something that nothing else in London provides for working-class women. A space where they can forget, however briefly, the crushing weight of their circumstances. Catherine becomes a regular at Margaret Finch's gin shop on Monmouth Street. Margaret understands her customers' needs perfectly. She keeps the gin strong, the prices low, and the atmosphere welcoming. Women can bring their children, nurse their babies, even sleep off a drunk in the back room if necessary. Margaret also understands that her customers aren't just buying alcohol, they're buying escape, and she's willing to provide whatever kind of escape they need. When Catherine can't afford gin, Margaret offers credit. When Catherine can't pay her debts, Margaret suggests alternative forms of payment. This is where Catherine's story takes a turn that illustrates just how completely gin is destroying traditional moral boundaries. Because Margaret Finch doesn't just sell gin, she also arranges other services for her customers. Services that allow women to earn the money they need to keep drinking. Catherine, the seamstress who once took pride in her reputation, who attended church regularly and saved money for better lodgings, Catherine begins selling herself to pay for gin. Not on the streets, but through Margaret's network of contacts, to men who prefer their encounters to happen in the relative safety and discretion of a gin shop's back room. And Catherine isn't alone. By 1715, gin shops across London are functioning as informal brothels, places where women trade their bodies for the alcohol they can no longer live without. The connection between gin and prostitution becomes so strong that the two are virtually inseparable in many neighbourhoods. This isn't moral judgment, it's economic reality. Gin costs money. Women have limited ways to earn money, and gin creates a physical dependency that makes rational decision-making nearly impossible. The combination inevitably pushes women toward prostitution as the fastest, easiest way to fund their addiction. But even this degradation isn't the bottom of the pit that London is falling into, because by 1720, something even worse is happening to the city's children. The children of London in 1720 are growing up in a world that would be unrecognisable to their grandparents. They're not just witnessing the gin crisis, they're living it, breathing it, becoming part of it in ways that will haunt the city for generations. Meet little Thomas Whitmore, 8 years old, living with his grandmother in a cellar on Rosemary Lane. Thomas's parents are both dead, his father from a fall at a construction site while drunk on gin, his mother from what the parish records diplomatically call complications of excessive drinking. His grandmother, 60-year-old Agnes, supports them both by selling gin from a wooden cart she pushes through the streets of Whitechapel. Thomas knows the gin trade better than most adults. He can tell the difference between good gin and the watered-down swill by smell alone. He knows which distillers add turpentine to increase potency, which ones use sugar to mask the taste of industrial alcohol. He's learned to count money, make change, and most importantly, how to spot customers who are too drunk to notice if they're shortchanged. But Thomas isn't just learning about gin as a business, he's learning about it as a way of life. When Agnes gets the shakes in the morning, Thomas knows to give her a small cup of gin before she can even get out of bed. When customers become violent or aggressive, Thomas knows to disappear into the maze of alleyways until things calm down. And Thomas is learning something else, something that will define his entire relationship with alcohol for the rest of his life. He's learning that gin makes everything better. When he's hungry and there's no food, a sip of gin makes the hunger pangs fade. When he's cold and they can't afford coal, gin warms him from the inside. When he's frightened by the violence and chaos around him, gin makes him feel brave. By the time Thomas is 10 years old, he's drinking gin regularly. Not constantly, not like the adults around him, but enough that his small body is already developing a tolerance. Agnes doesn't try to stop him. In her mind, gin is medicine, and Thomas needs medicine to survive in their world. The parish schools, what few exist, report that children arrive drunk or hungover with increasing frequency. Teachers describe students who smell of gin at 8 in the morning, who fall asleep at their desks, who become violent or hysterical without warning. Some children are so malnourished and alcohol damaged that they can barely form letters or remember simple arithmetic. But formal education is becoming irrelevant anyway. The children of Gin Alley are learning different skills, skills that their alcohol-soaked environment demands. They're learning how to survive when the adults around them are incapacitated. They're learning how to find food when there's no money. They're learning how to avoid the worst dangers of street life while navigating a world where traditional authority figures have simply disappeared. Meet Mary Hutchinson, 9 years old, who's become the primary caregiver for her 3 younger siblings. Mary's mother, once the Mary Jenkins we met earlier, now spends most of her time in a gin-induced stupor. Her father Thomas died 2 years ago when he fell into the Thames while drunk, his body recovered 3 days later by the river police. Mary has learned to steal food from market stalls, to beg effectively from the few sober adults she encounters, to keep her siblings quiet when their mother is sleeping off a drunk. But most importantly, Mary has learned that sometimes the only way to make her siblings stop crying from hunger is to give them small amounts of gin. This isn't cruelty, it's survival. Gin stops the hunger pangs. It makes the children sleep when there's no comfortable place to rest. It numbs the emotional pain of abandonment and neglect. Mary doesn't understand that she's creating new addicts. She only knows that gin solves immediate problems. Yesai. The sight of children drinking gin openly in the streets becomes so common that it stops shocking observers. Visitors home about seeing toddlers stumbling through markets, clearly to London right intoxicated, while adults step around them without a second glance. Children as young as 4 or 5 line up outside gin shops with cups and bottles, sent by parents or older siblings to purchase the family's daily supply. But the children aren't just consumers in this economy. They're becoming active participants in ways that reveal just how completely gin has corrupted London society. Because desperate gin sellers have discovered that children are remarkably effective at attracting customers and avoiding law enforcement. Little Sarah Pemberton is 7 years old when she starts working for a gin operation in Covent Garden. Sarah's job is simple. She sits outside the theatre district with a cup of gin and a small wooden stool, looking as pathetic and hungry as possible. When well-dressed theatre-goers pass by, Sarah offers them a taste of gin for a penny. The psychology is brilliant. Respectable people who would never enter a gin shop in the slums feel safe buying from a child in a busy public area. They tell themselves they're helping an orphan, not supporting the gin trade. Some customers even give Sarah extra money out of pity, not realizing that every penny goes directly to the gin sellers who employ her. Sarah learns to play her role perfectly. She practices looking hungry even when she's not. She learns to make her clothes look more ragged than they are. She discovers that tears increase sales, so she learns to cry on command. And most importantly, she learns that taking a small sip of gin before approaching potential customers makes her braver, more convincing. Within her performance months, Sarah is drinking gin regularly, not just as a performance aid, but because her small body has developed a physical dependence. The gin sellers don't mind. They actually prefer addicted children, because addiction ensures loyalty. A child who needs gin to function won't run away or steal money to buy food instead. The use of children in the gin trade becomes so widespread that entire networks develop. Children as young as 5 carry messages between gin shops, warning of police raids, or informing sellers about new customers. They act as lookouts during illegal distilling operations. They even help transport gin in small quantities that are less likely to attract official attention. But perhaps most disturbing is how children become enforcers in the gin trade's internal disputes. When a customer owes money or a competing seller moves into someone's territory, children are sent to deliver threats or carry out petty acts of revenge. Adults assume children are harmless, making them perfect agents for activities that would immediately attract suspicion if performed by adults. 10-year-old William Drake becomes notorious in the Drury Lane area for his effectiveness as a debt collector. William is small for his age, malnourished and sickly looking, but he has a reputation for vicious creativity when customers don't pay what they owe. He sets fires in debtors' rooms, poisons their food with industrial chemicals, even arranges for them to be robbed by older children. William isn't naturally violent. He's learned violence as a survival skill. The gin sellers who employ him reward him with alcohol, food, and protection. Without their support, William would be just another starving orphan on London streets. With their support, he has power, purpose, and a steady supply of the gin his body now requires to function. The transformation of London's children into active participants in the gin trade represents something unprecedented in English society. These aren't just victims of adult behaviour, they're becoming agents of the very system that's destroying their communities. They're learning that violence, deception, and exploitation are normal business practices. They're internalising the moral corruption that gin has brought to their world. By 1720, an entire generation of London children is growing up without any memory of a world before gin. They don't know that families once ate meals together without anyone being drunk. They don't know that parents once worked regular jobs and came home sober. They don't know that children once played games that didn't involve alcohol or violence. The Reverend Thomas Wilson attempts to document the extent of childhood alcoholism in his parish and discovers numbers that seem impossible to believe. Of the 300 children under the age of 12 in St. Botolph's parish, Wilson estimates that at least 200 drink gin regularly. More than half show signs of physical addiction. Nearly all have been involved in the gin trade in some capacity. But Wilson's most disturbing discovery concerns what gin is doing to children's development. He interviews dozens of children and finds that their understanding of basic moral concepts has been completely warped by their environment. They see nothing wrong with theft if the victim is drunk. They consider violence normal if it's related to business disputes. They view addiction not as a disease, but as an inevitable part of adult life. 8-year-old Jenny Morrison tells Wilson matter-of-factly that she expects to be dead before her 15th birthday, just like her mother and older sister. When Wilson asks why, Jenny explains that everyone dies from gin eventually. It's just a matter of time. She shows no fear or sadness about this prediction. It's simply a fact of life in her world. This fatalistic acceptance of early death becomes common among London's children. They've watched so many adults die from gin-related causes that death seems like a natural progression rather than a tragedy to be avoided. Children make plans that extend only weeks or months into the future because they genuinely don't expect to live long enough for longer-term planning to matter. The psychological damage extends beyond individual children to entire communities. Traditional childhood activities disappear because there are no sober adults to organize or supervise them. Children don't learn songs, games, or stories that previous generations passed down because the adults who would have taught them are too drunk to remember or care. Instead, children create their own culture, and that culture revolves around gin. They invent games that mimic adult drinking behavior. They sing songs about gin sellers and drunk customers. They tell stories about legendary gin drinkers who could consume impossible quantities without passing out. This child-created gin culture becomes self-perpetuating. Older children teach younger children the skills they need to survive in a gin-soaked world. They pass on knowledge about where to find the strongest gin, how to avoid the most dangerous drunk adults, which gin sellers can be trusted, and which ones are violent. Most tragically, they pass on the assumption that gin addiction is inevitable. Children as young as 6 or 7 speak casually about when they'll become proper drinkers, as if alcoholism is a rite of passage rather than a disease. They compare different types of gin the way children in other times and places might compare toysolization of childhood or games. The normed alcoholism reaches such extremes that sober children become objects of suspicion and ridicule. Children who refuse gin are considered weak, strange, or pretentious. They're excluded from social groups, denied protection from older children, sometimes even attacked for their refusal to participate in drinking culture. 12-year-old Robert Ashford discovers this when he tries to convince other children in his neighborhood to stop drinking gin. Robert's father was a Methodist preacher before gin destroyed his faith and his family, and Robert retains some memory of religious teachings about sobriety and self-control. Robert's attempts at temperance advocacy make him a target for other children who see his message as a threat to their way of life. They pour gin in his water, hide gin-soaked rags in his bedding, even force him to drink by holding him down and pouring gin down his throat. Eventually, Robert gives up his resistance and becomes as addicted as everyone else around him. By 1722, London has created something that has never existed before in human history, a society where childhood alcoholism is not just tolerated but expected, where children are active participants in the alcohol trade, where an entire generation is growing up with no concept of sobriety as a normal state of being. The implications extend far beyond individual tragedy. These children will become adults, and they'll raise the next generation based on what they've learned. The skills they're developing, the values they're internalizing, the assumptions they're making about human nature and social relationships, all of this will shape London's society for decades to come. But even as the crisis reaches these unprecedented depths, even as an entire generation of children disappears into gin-soaked oblivion, the worst is still to come. Because the gin makers and sellers, seeing the incredible profits available from child customers, are about to take their business model to even more horrifying extremes. And the government, which created this crisis through misguided policy, is finally beginning to understand what they've unleashed. The response, when it comes, will be as dramatic and violent as the crisis itself. But that response is still years away. In the meantime, London continues its descent into a hell of its own making, where children sell their souls for sips of gin, where mothers choose bottles over babies, and where an entire civilization teeters on the edge of complete collapse. The story of Mary Jenkins selling her child was horrific, but it was just one transaction among thousands. The story of Jonathan Hartwell losing everything to gin was tragic, but he was just one professional among many. The story of children like Thomas and Mary and Sarah and William becoming addicted before they're old enough to understand what addiction means. This is the real horror of the gin crisis. Because these children represent London's future, and that future is being poisoned one sip at a time. The gin sellers weren't content with just destroying adults and children. By 1723, they had discovered an even more profitable market, one that would push London's moral collapse to depths that seemed impossible, even by the standards of Gin Alley. They began targeting pregnant women. Meet Elizabeth Thornton, 19 years old and 6 months pregnant with her first child. Elizabeth works as a laundress in Bethnal Green, standing for 12 hours a day over steaming wash basins, her swollen belly making the work increasingly difficult. Her husband died 3 months ago in a gin shop brawl, leaving Elizabeth to support herself and her unborn child on wages that barely cover rent for a corner of a shared room. The gin sellers notice Elizabeth immediately. Pregnant women are ideal customers because their desperation runs deeper than ordinary poverty. They're not just hungry or cold or tired, they're terrified. Terrified of childbirth without medical care. Terrified of raising a child alone. Terrified of the workhouse, where pregnant women are separated from their babies immediately after birth. Gin offers temporary relief from this terror, and the sellers know exactly how to exploit it. They approach Elizabeth outside the church, where she goes to pray for her unborn child's health. They offer her gin at half the usual price, claiming they're helping a poor widow in her time of need. Elizabeth resists at first. She's heard the stories about gin and pregnancy, whispered warnings from other women about babies born twisted or dead from mothers who drank too much. But the fear gnaws at her constantly, and the gin sellers are persistent. They follow her to work, to the market, even to her lodgings, always offering that same discounted price, always emphasizing how much she deserves relief from her suffering. Finally, Elizabeth breaks. It's a cold Tuesday morning in November, and she's been awake all night with the baby kicking and her back aching, and the woman in the next bed coughing up blood. Elizabeth buys a quartern of gin before breakfast, telling herself it's just to help her sleep for an hour. But gin affects pregnant women differently than other customers. The alcohol crosses directly into the baby's bloodstream, creating 2 addicts instead of 1. Elizabeth doesn't understand the science, but she notices that when she drinks gin, the baby stops kicking so violently. The constant movement that keeps her awake at night settles into a peaceful stillness. What Elizabeth interprets as the baby becoming calm is actually the fetus becoming intoxicated. But the gin sellers don't explain this. They simply note that Elizabeth returns the next day, and the day after that, buying increasingly larger quantities as her tolerance builds. By December, Elizabeth is drinking gin throughout her work day. The other laundresses notice that she staggers, that her speech slurs, that she sometimes vomits into the wash basins. But they don't intervene. They have their own problems, their own addictions, their own fears about survival in a city where sobriety has become a luxury few can afford. Elizabeth goes into labour on a frozen morning in January 1724. There's no midwife, no doctor, just a gin-soaked neighbour woman who's helped deliver babies before. The labour is long and difficult, complicated by Elizabeth's malnutrition and alcohol consumption. The baby, when it finally arrives, is unlike anything the neighbour woman has ever seen. It's smaller than it should be, with features that seem somehow wrong, compressed and angular. Its cry is weak and strange, more like a mewing than the healthy wail of a newborn. Most disturbing of all, the baby shows signs of withdrawal from the moment of birth. shaking and sweating and refusing to nurse. Elizabeth doesn't understand what's happening. She only knows that her baby seems to be in constant pain, crying incessantly unless she gives it small amounts of gin mixed with milk. The gin calms the baby temporarily, but the doses have to increase constantly as its tiny body develops tolerance. The baby dies at 6 weeks old. The parish records list the cause of death simply as failure to thrive. But Elizabeth knows the truth. She killed her child with gin as surely as if she'd strangled it with her own hands. Elizabeth's story repeats itself hundreds of times across London. Pregnant women, desperate for relief from fear and poverty. Gin sellers eager to create customers who literally cannot escape their addiction. And babies born into a world where alcohol poisoning begins in the womb. The gin sellers develop specific techniques for targeting pregnant women. They station themselves outside churches, knowing that pregnant women often turn to religion when they feel most vulnerable. They offer special mother's gin that they claim is healthier for expectant mothers, though it's actually the same industrial alcohol mixed with sugar and herbs. Most cynically, they create payment plans specifically designed for pregnant women. A woman can buy gin on credit during her pregnancy, with the debt to be paid after the baby is born. Of course, by then, both mother and child are addicted, making it impossible to stop drinking long enough to earn the money needed to pay the debt. Margaret Finch, the gin seller we met earlier, becomes particularly notorious for her treatment of pregnant customers. She converts the back room of her shop into a crude maternity ward, where addicted mothers can give birth surrounded by gin bottles and other addicted women. Margaret charges rent for the space, sells gin throughout labour, and often ends up owning the babies when mothers can't pay their accumulated debts. These babies born in gin shops become commodities in a trade that horrifies even hardened observers. Margaret sells healthy babies to childless couples who don't ask too many questions about where the infants came from. Sickly babies she gives to other gin sellers who use them as props to attract sympathetic customers. Babies who show signs of severe alcohol damage she simply abandons in doorways or throws into the Thames. The scale of this trade becomes apparent when parish officials attempt to track birth and death records in gin-heavy neighbourhoods. In Whitechapel, deaths of children under 1 year old increased by 400% between 1720 and 1725. In St Giles, more babies die than are born in some months, suggesting that infants are being brought in from other areas specifically to die. But the pregnant women themselves suffer fates that are often worse than death. Meet Anne Cooper, 22 years old and pregnant with her third child. Anne's first 2 children died in infancy, both showing the same symptoms as Elizabeth Thornton's baby. Anne knows that gin killed her children, but she can't stop drinking. Anne's withdrawal symptoms during her third pregnancy are so severe that she experiences seizures, hallucinations, and periods of complete unconsciousness. She tries repeatedly to quit drinking, but the physical agony is unbearable. Her body shakes so violently that she can't hold food or water. She sees demons crawling on her skin, hears voices telling her to kill herself and her unborn child. The only relief comes from gin, and each time Anne drinks, she knows she's poisoning her baby. But the choice isn't between drinking and not drinking. It's between drinking and dying from withdrawal. Anne chooses to live, even though living means destroying her child. Anne's third baby is born alive, but profoundly damaged. It cannot nurse properly, cannot focus its eyes, cannot stop the constant trembling that marks alcohol withdrawal in newborns. Anne tries to care for the child, but her own addiction makes consistent care impossible. She forgets to feed the baby, sometimes for days at a time. She passes out while holding it, dropping it repeatedly. She gives it gin to stop its crying, not realizing that she's ensuring its addiction will be permanent. The baby survives for 3 months, growing weaker and more damaged each day. When it finally dies, Anne feels only relief. The guilt and responsibility of caring for a child while addicted had become unbearable. Now she can drink without worrying about anyone else. Anne dies 2 years later from what the parish records call complications of excessive drinking. She's found in her room surrounded by empty gin bottles, having essentially drunk herself to death over a period of weeks. Her body is so damaged by alcohol that the undertaker has difficulty preparing it for burial. These stories of mothers and babies destroyed by gin represent something unprecedented in English society. Never before has a legal substance been available that could create addiction in unborn children. Never before has maternal behaviour been so completely divorced from infant welfare. The gin crisis has broken the most fundamental bond in human society, the connection between mother and child. But the damage extends beyond individual families to the very concept of childhood itself. By 1725, London has entire neighbourhoods where the sight of healthy children has become so rare that visitors comment on it in their letters and diaries. Areas like St Giles and Whitechapel have become places where childhood effectively doesn't exist, where 5-year-olds care for 3-year-olds while their parents lie unconscious, where 7-year-olds run businesses and 10-year-olds have the responsibilities of adults. Meet Timothy Walsh, 11 years old and the effective head of his family. Timothy's mother gave birth to him in a gin shop and has been drunk for most of his life. His father disappeared years ago, probably dead in some alley or floating in the Thames. Timothy has 2 younger siblings, ages 8 and 5, both showing signs of the developmental damage that comes from prenatal alcohol exposure. Timothy supports his family by running errands for gin sellers, carrying messages between shops, and occasionally stealing food from market stalls when no one is watching. He's learned to forge simple documents, count prices with adults who are often money accurately, and negotiate too drunk to think clearly. But Timothy's most valuable skill is his ability to care for severely intoxicated adults. He knows how to position unconscious people so they won't choke on their own vomit. He can recognize the difference between ordinary drunkenness and potentially fatal alcohol poisoning. He understands which combinations of gin and other substances are likely to kill someone and which will just make them sick. These skills make Timothy valuable to the gin trade in ways that go beyond simple child labour. Gin sellers hire him to watch their customers, to intervene when someone is drinking themselves to death, to clean up after violent incidents, to dispose of bodies when intervention comes too late. Timothy doesn't see this work as unusual or disturbing. In his world, death is a daily occurrence, violence is normal business practice, and caring for addicted adults is simply what children do. He has no concept of childhood as a time of innocence or play or education. His childhood consists entirely of survival skills and premature responsibilities. The transformation of children, like Timothy, into miniature adults reflects the complete breakdown of traditional family structures in gin-affected neighbourhoods. Parents are too incapacitated to provide guidance, protection, or care. Extended families have been destroyed by addiction and death. Community institutions like churches and schools have either closed or become irrelevant to daily survival. In this vacuum, children create their own social structures, and those structures mirror the gin trade that dominates their environment. They organize themselves into gangs based on territory and business relationships. They develop hierarchies based on who can drink the most without passing out, who can steal the most effectively, who can fight the most viciously. These child gangs become increasingly sophisticated over time, eventually functioning as junior versions of adult criminal organizations. They control territory, collect debts, engage in turf wars with other gangs, and most importantly, recruit new members from younger children who have nowhere else to turn. 12-year-old Sarah Mitchell becomes the leader of one such gang in the Drury Lane area. Sarah was born in a gin shop and has never lived anywhere that wasn't connected to the gin trade. Her gang consists of 15 children, ranging in age from 6 to 14, all of them homeless, all of them addicted to gin, all of them engaged in various forms of criminal activity to support their habit. Sarah's gang operates with military-like discipline and organization. New members must prove their loyalty by completing increasingly dangerous tasks. They have established territories that they defend violently against encroachment by other gangs. They have developed sophisticated systems for distributing stolen goods and sharing profits from their various illegal enterprises. Most importantly, Sarah's gang has created its own internal economy based entirely on gin. Members are paid for their work in alcohol rather than money. Status within the gang is determined by alcohol tolerance and drinking capacity. Punishment for rule violations consists of being denied gin, which for addicted children is essentially torture. The existence of organized child gangs centered around alcohol consumption represents the complete inversion of traditional social values. These children have created a society where addiction is strength, where violence is virtue, where theft is industry, and where loyalty is measured entirely by shared participation in self-destruction. But perhaps most disturbing is how these child gangs interact with the adult world around them. Rather than being protected or rescued by adults, they're exploited by them. Adult gin sellers use the gangs as distribution networks, sources of labor, and enforcement mechanisms. Adult criminals recruit gang members for more serious crimes, knowing that children face lighter punishments if caught. The children, in turn, lose whatever remaining connection they might have had to conventional morality. They see adults as customers, competitors, or threats, but never as authority figures or sources of guidance. They view society as a collection of opportunities for exploitation, rather than a community that might offer support or protection. By 1725, entire sections of London have become places where normal social relationships have simply ceased to exist. Neighborhoods where children prey on adults, where mothers abandon babies, where families dissolve into collections of competing addicts, where traditional concepts of right and wrong have been replaced by the simple calculus of gin acquisition. The Reverend Josiah Woodward attempts to conduct a survey of moral conditions in St. Bartholomew's parish and discovers a situation that defies his ability to describe in conventional religious terms. He writes to his bishop that he has found communities where the very notion of sin has been drowned in gin, where children speak of theft and violence as naturally as they might discuss the weather, where mothers sell their own flesh for spirits with no more thought than they would give to selling vegetables at market. Woodward's letters describe scenes that read like visions from the apocalypse. Children fighting over the contents of dead men's pockets while the bodies are still warm. Women giving birth in gutters while other women steal their clothes. Entire families living in rooms ankle-deep in empty gin bottles, too drunk to notice the smell of their own waste. But Woodward's most disturbing observation concerns what he calls the normalization of horror. People living in these conditions don't see their circumstances as unusual or tragic. They've adapted to levels of violence, degradation, and desperation that would have been unimaginable just a generation earlier. They've created new definitions of normal that accommodate behaviors that previous generations would have considered evidence of demonic possession. This psychological adaptation to extreme circumstances means that even when help is offered, it's often rejected or misunderstood. Woodward tries to establish a charity school in his parish and discovers that children don't understand why they should learn to read when they already know how to steal effectively. Parents don't understand why their children should attend school when they could be earning money in the gin trade. The charity fails not because of lack of funding or community opposition, but because the people it's intended to help have developed survival strategies that make conventional education seem irrelevant. Why learn arithmetic when you can count gin bottles? Why learn to write when you can negotiate prices through gestures and grunts? Why study religion when your daily reality makes the concept of divine mercy seem like a cruel joke? The failure of traditional charitable approaches reveals the depth of social transformation that gin has caused. This isn't just a problem of poverty or crime or addiction that can be solved through conventional means. It's a complete reconstruction of human society around the acquisition and consumption of alcohol. And this reconstruction is accelerating. By 1725, London is producing nearly 30 million gallons of gin per year. The gin trade employs hundreds of thousands of people directly or indirectly. Entire neighborhoods have economies based entirely on alcohol production, distribution, and consumption. The profits are enormous, and they're creating a new class of wealthy gin merchants who have political influence and social respectability despite the obvious devastation their product is causing. These merchants lobby against regulation, fund political campaigns, and use their wealth to purchase titles and estates that give them status in polite society. Meanwhile, the human cost continues to mount. Parish burial records show that life expectancy in gin-heavy neighborhoods has dropped to levels not seen since the Black Death. Infant mortality rates approach 50% in some areas. Crime rates have increased by factors that make statistical analysis almost meaningless. But statistics can't capture the true horror of what London has become. Numbers can't convey the sight of children drinking themselves unconscious in broad daylight, while adults step over their bodies. They can't describe the smell of neighborhoods where sanitation has collapsed because no one is sober enough to maintain basic cleanliness. They can't express the sound of constant weeping from mothers who have sold their children. They're from children who have lost parents, from entire communities mourning their own destruction. London in 1725 has become something that has never existed before in human history, a major city in the process of drinking itself to death. Not metaphorically, but literally. A place where the social fabric has been dissolved in alcohol, where traditional human relationships have been replaced by the economics of addiction, where an entire civilization is committing slow-motion suicide one sip at a time. And the worst part is that this transformation is still accelerating. The gin crisis hasn't reached its peak yet. The most horrifying chapters of this story are still to come, as London descends even deeper into an abyss that seems to have no bottom. The children born into this world in 1725 will grow up knowing no other reality. They'll become adults who consider mass addiction normal, who view violence as standard business practice, who see the destruction of families as an inevitable part of life. They'll raise children of their own based on these assumptions, creating a second generation even more damaged than the first. But somewhere in the corridors of power, a few voices are beginning to suggest that perhaps something should be done about the gin crisis. The suggestions are tentative, the proposed solutions inadequate, but for the first time since 1690, some officials are wondering whether unlimited gin production might not be the brilliant policy they once thought it was. The response, when it finally comes, will be as dramatic and violent as the crisis itself. But that response is still years away. And in the meantime, London continues its inexorable slide toward complete social collapse. The gin sellers, seeing the incredible profits available from their destroyed customers, are about to push their business model to even more horrifying extremes. And the customers, trapped in cycles of addiction that make rational choice impossible, are about to discover depths of degradation that will shock even those who thought they had seen everything. The story of Gin Alley is far from over, and the worst is yet to come. The gin merchants who had grown rich from London's misery were about to discover just how much deeper they could push human degradation. By 1726, they had identified what they considered their most valuable market segment: people who had already lost everything else. Meet William Cartwright, a man who once owned a successful bakery on Ludgate Hill. William employed 4 apprentices, lived in comfortable rooms above his shop, and was respected in his parish as a reliable member of the community. His bread was known throughout the City its quality, and his morning rolls favourite among clerks and merchants heading to work. That were A, was before gin found William started intently enough. A customer paid for bread with a bottle of fine Dutch gin instead of coins, claiming it was worth more than the money he owed. William accepted the trade, thinking he could sell the gin for a profit. Instead, he opened it that evening after a particularly long day of kneading dough and stoking ovens. The gin was unlike anything William had ever tasted. Where beer made him sleepy and content, gin made him feel powerful, creative, alive in ways he'd never experienced. The aches in his back from years of heavy lifting disappeared. The worries about flour prices and competing bakeries faded into insignificance. For the first time in years, William felt genuinely happy. Within 6 months, William was buying gin regularly from a seller who had noticed his interest. The seller, a shrewd woman named Rebecca Morse, understood exactly how to manage customers like William. She offered him credit when money was tight, accepted payment in bread when he was short on coins, and gradually increased his purchases by suggesting that a successful businessman deserved better quality gin than what the common people drank. By 1727, William was drinking gin throughout his working day. He told himself it improved his baking, made him more creative with recipes, helped him deal with difficult customers. But his apprentices noticed that Master Cartwright's bread was becoming inconsistent. Some loaves were burned, others underbaked. He forgot orders, mixed up deliveries, sometimes passed out over his workbench with his face in the dough. The transformation accelerated rapidly. William began selling his equipment to buy gin. First, the copper pots he used for special orders, then his best knives, then the oak tables his father had built for the bakery 50 years earlier. Each sale was supposed to be temporary, just until business improved, just until he could get back on his feet. But William's feet were no longer steady enough to support him. His hands shook so badly without gin that he couldn't measure flour accurately. His vision blurred, making it impossible to tell when bread was properly baked. Most devastating of all, his sense of smell, crucial for a baker, had been destroyed by constant gin consumption. By early 1728, William had sold everything except the bakery building itself. He lived in a single room that reeked of gin and failure, surviving on scraps of stale bread and whatever alcohol Rebecca Morse would sell him on credit. The business that had supported him and 4 apprentices was gone, destroyed not by economic hardship or competition, but by gin. But William's story was just beginning, because Rebecca Morse, like gin sellers throughout London, had discovered that customers who had lost everything weren't worthless. They were actually more valuable than ever. Desperate people will do things that merely poor people won't consider. Rebecca approached William with a proposition. She would forgive his substantial debt and provide him with a steady supply of gin if he would help her expand her business into new neighbourhoods. William's role would be simple. He would use his remaining respectability, his knowledge of London's geography, and his connections with former customers to identify potential new markets for gin. William accepted immediately. The alternative was death from withdrawal, and William had watched enough people die that way to know it wasn't quick or peaceful. His first assignment was to map out the taverns, alehouses, and shops in areas where gin had not yet penetrated deeply. Rebecca wanted to know which establishments might be willing to sell gin alongside their traditional products. William proved remarkably effective at this intelligence gathering. His years as a baker had given him knowledge of London's commercial networks that Rebecca found invaluable. He knew which shopkeepers were struggling financially and might welcome additional income from gin sales. He understood the daily routines of working people and could predict where demand for cheap alcohol would be highest. But Rebecca had more ambitious plans for William. She was part of a growing network of gin sellers who were no longer content to wait for customers to find them. They were actively recruiting new addicts, targeting specific populations with customized approaches designed to maximize addiction rates. William's next assignment was to visit the workshops and manufactories where he had once delivered bread. His job was to offer free samples of gin to workers during their lunch breaks, claiming it was a promotional effort by a new distillery. The workers, most of whom earned barely enough to afford beer, were delighted by the opportunity to try spirits they could never normally afford. The psychology was brilliant. Workers who received free gin during lunch returned to their afternoon tasks feeling energized and confident. They worked faster, complained less, seemed happier with their jobs. Supervisors noticed the improvement and didn't ask too many questions about its source. Within weeks, workers were asking where they could buy the same gin they'd been sampling. William provided the answer. He directed them to Rebecca's network of cellars, armed with special introductory prices for new customers. The prices were genuinely attractive, designed to hook new addicts rather than generate immediate profits. Rebecca understood that a customer who became addicted would eventually pay far more than any reasonable markup on individual transactions. The strategy worked beyond Rebecca's most optimistic projections. Entire workshops began shutting down during lunch breaks as workers lined up to buy gin from William's contacts. Productivity initially increased as gin-energized workers pushed themselves harder, but within months, the pattern reversed. Workers began drinking before their shifts, during breaks, sometimes even while operating dangerous machinery. Accidents multiplied rapidly. A weaver lost 3 fingers when gin-impaired reflexes prevented him from pulling his hand away from moving gears. A blacksmith suffered severe burns when alcohol-dulled senses caused him to misjudge the temperature of heated metal. A carpenter fell from scaffolding and broke his back, leaving him permanently crippled and unemployable. But these accidents didn't slow the spread of gin consumption. Instead, they created new marketing opportunities. Injured workers, unable to perform their old jobs, became desperate for any source of income or relief from their circumstances. Rebecca's network recruited them as sellers, offering gin at cost in exchange for establishing new retail locations in neighborhoods where traditional sellers might be unwelcome. William watched this expansion with a mixture of pride and horror. Pride because his intelligence and connections were driving the growth of Rebecca's business. Horror because he could see the human cost mounting daily. But the horror was manageable as long as he had enough gin to numb his conscience. By 1729, William had become one of Rebecca's most valuable assets. He had identified hundreds of potential new customers, established gin sales in dozens of previously untapped locations, and recruited scores of new sellers from among the injured, desperate, and unemployable. His reward was a steady supply of high-quality gin and a small room above one of Rebecca's shops. But Rebecca had one more assignment for William, one that would test the limits of what a former respectable businessman would do to maintain his addiction. She wanted him to target children, not the street children who were already drinking gin regularly, but the children of working families who still maintained some pretense of respectability. Children who attended charity schools, who lived in homes with both parents, who might grow up to become productive members of society if they weren't intercepted first. William's method was sophisticated and deeply evil. He positioned himself outside charity schools during dismissal times, offering children small sweet biscuits that he claimed were left over from his baking days. The biscuits were genuine, well-made, and delicious. They were also soaked in gin. The children, many of whom rarely tasted anything sweet, eagerly accepted William's offerings. The gin content was carefully calibrated, strong enough to create a pleasant sensation, but not strong enough to cause obvious intoxication. Children who ate William's biscuits felt happy, confident, more energetic than usual. They associated these positive feelings with William himself. After several weeks of building relationships with children through gin-soaked treats, William began offering them small sips of what he called medicine for various common ailments. Stomach aches, headaches, nervousness about school examinations, all could be cured by a small taste of William's special medicine. The children, trusting William because of his kindness and generosity, accepted these offerings without question. They didn't recognize the taste of gin because it was mixed with honey and herbs that masked its harshness. They only knew that William's medicine made them feel better, braver, more capable of dealing with their problems. Within months, children as young as 7 were seeking out William regularly, complaining of ailments that could only be cured by his special medicine. They began bringing friends who also needed treatment. Some started offering small payments, pennies they'd saved or stolen, for extra doses of the medicine that made everything seem manageable. William had created a network of child addicts who didn't even realize they were addicted. They thought they were treating medical conditions with helpful medicine provided by a kind former baker who cared about their welfare. The reality was that William was systematically destroying their developing minds and bodies for the profit of Rebecca's gin empire. But William's greatest success, from Rebecca's perspective, came when the children began asking if they could take medicine home for sick relatives. Parents who wouldn't normally trust alcohol from street sellers were willing to try medicine recommended by their own children, especially when those children seemed healthier and happier since beginning treatment. This created a perfect distribution system. Children became unwitting sales agents, bringing gin into homes where it would never have been welcome otherwise. Parents who started drinking William's medicine for legitimate ailments quickly discovered that it also helped with less tangible problems like worry, sadness, and the general difficulty of surviving in London's increasingly harsh economic environment. The expansion of gin consumption through children's medicine programs represented a new level of sophisticated evil in the gin trade. This wasn't just opportunistic selling to people who were already desperate. It was systematic creation of addiction in populations that had been previously resistant to gin's appeal. Rebecca's network documented their methods carefully, sharing successful techniques with other gin sellers across London. The child medicine program was replicated in dozens of neighbourhoods, adapted to local conditions, but always following the same basic pattern. Build trust through genuine kindness, introduce alcohol disguised as medicine, gradually increase dosages, convert children into distribution agents for adult customers. By 1730, an estimated 5,000 London children were regularly consuming gin through various medicine programs operated by different gin sellers. These children showed classic signs of developing alcoholism, but the symptoms were interpreted by parents and teachers as improvements in behaviour and health. Children who had been shy became confident. Children who had been restless became calm. Children who had struggled with learning became more focused, at least initially. Parents praised the beneficial effects of the medicine programs, not realizing that they were watching their children develop dependencies that would likely kill them before they reached adulthood. The success of child-focused marketing led Rebecca to experiment with even more targeted approaches. She developed specific gin formulations for different populations, each designed to appeal to particular psychological needs and social circumstances. For pregnant women, she created Mother's Comfort, a gin mixture that included herbs traditionally used to ease childbirth pain. For elderly people, she offered Grandfather's Strength, which combined gin with ingredients that temporarily relieved arthritis and other age-related ailments. For young men, she produced Courage Tonic, a high-proof mixture that made users feel invincible and attractive product was marketed to women. Each not as alcohol, with testimony, but as medicines from satisfied customers and claims about health benefits that sounded plausible to people without medical knowledge. The marketing was so effective that many customers genuinely believed they were purchasing medicine rather than spirits. This medicalization of gin consumption allowed Rebecca's network to penetrate social groups that had previously resisted alcohol marketing. Religious families who would never enter a gin shop willingly purchased Mother's Comfort for expectant mothers. Respectable elderly couples bought Grandfather's Strength to manage the aches and pains of aging. Young apprentices saved their pennies to buy Courage Tonic before approaching potential romantic partners. The medical marketing also provided psychological cover for people who wanted to drink but felt guilty about alcohol consumption. They could tell themselves and others that they were treating medical conditions rather than indulging in recreational drinking. This rationalization made it easier to ignore the obvious signs of developing addiction. William observed the expansion of Rebecca's medical marketing with growing unease. He had rationalized his own involvement by telling himself that adults could make their own choices about drinking, but targeting children with disguised alcohol felt different, more evil, harder to justify even to his gin-soaked conscience. But William's conscience was a luxury he could no longer afford. His physical dependence on gin was now so complete that even short periods without alcohol caused severe withdrawal symptoms. He experienced tremors, sweating, nausea, and terrifying hallucinations whenever his gin supply was interrupted. The fear of withdrawal was stronger than any moral qualms about his work. More importantly, William had discovered that expressing doubts about Rebecca's methods led to reduced gin rations. Rebecca made it clear that her generosity depended on enthusiastic cooperation with all aspects of her business. Employees who showed insufficient commitment found their alcohol supplies mysteriously diminished, forcing them to choose between moral reservations and physical agony. William chose survival over morality, as most people in his situation did. He continued developing new methods for targeting children, expanding the medicine programs into new neighborhoods, and identifying fresh populations that might be vulnerable to gin marketing. His success at these tasks earned him increased status within Rebecca's organization and more reliable access to the alcohol his body required. But William's promotion within the gin trade came with new responsibilities that pushed him even further from his former moral framework. Rebecca assigned him to oversee the recruitment and training of new sellers, particularly those who would be working with children and families. The training program William developed was remarkably sophisticated for its time. New sellers learned psychology, salesmanship, and basic medical terminology that would make their pitches more convincing. They studied the specific vulnerabilities of different social groups and practiced tailoring their approaches accordingly. Most importantly, they learned to identify and exploit personal tragedies that made potential customers vulnerable to addiction. Recent deaths, job losses, family disputes, and financial crises all created opportunities for gin sellers to position their products as solutions to emotional pain. William taught new sellers to listen carefully to community gossip, to befriend people who were sources of information about neighborhood problems, and to position themselves as helpful community members rather than predatory merchants. The most successful sellers became trusted figures in their neighborhoods, people to whom others turned for advice, comfort, and assistance during difficult times. This community integration made gin selling far more effective than simple commercial transactions. When trusted community members recommended gin as medicine or comfort, people were much more likely to try it than when approached by obvious merchants. The personal relationships also made it harder for customers to recognize that they were being systematically addicted. By 1731, Rebecca's network had expanded to include more than 200 sellers operating across London. They had developed sophisticated distribution systems, targeted marketing campaigns, and recruitment programs that could create new addicts faster than traditional methods ever could. Most impressively, they had achieved all this while maintaining the appearance of legitimate medical and social services. The success of Rebecca's model inspired imitators throughout London's gin trade. Other sellers began developing their own medicine programs, community integration strategies, and child recruitment methods. The competition drove innovation, with different networks constantly developing new techniques for creating and maintaining addiction in previously resistant populations. But this innovation came at a cost that was becoming visible, even to casual observers of London life. By 1731, entire neighbourhoods had been transformed by the expansion of sophisticated gin marketing. Areas that had maintained some stability and social cohesion just 5 years earlier were now indistinguishable from the worst slums of Gin Alley. The Reverend Edmund Gibson, Bishop of London, attempted to document the changes in his diocese and found a situation that challenged his understanding of human nature itself. He wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury that he had discovered communities where the very children speak of gin as their mothers might once have spoken of milk, where families gather not for meals but for drinking, where the morning prayer in many households has been replaced by the morning drink. Bishop Gibson's letters describe specific incidents that reveal the depth of social transformation. He writes about a charity school where teachers discovered that students were performing better on examinations after receiving what they believed was medicine from a kind community benefactor. The medicine was later revealed to be gin mixed with honey, and the improved performance was actually the temporary confidence boost that alcohol provides to anxious children. He documents a parish where infant mortality rates had improved dramatically over a 6-month period, leading to celebration among community leaders who attributed the change to better medical care. Investigation revealed that the improvement was due to mothers giving gin-based medicine to sick babies, which provided temporary relief from symptoms while actually accelerating the underlying conditions that would eventually kill them. Most disturbing to Gibson were his encounters with parents who genuinely believed they were providing beneficial medical treatment to their children through gin consumption. These weren't ignorant or neglectful parents, but caring mothers and fathers who had been systematically deceived by sellers using sophisticated psychological manipulation. One mother showed Gibson a carefully kept record of her 8-year-old son's daily doses of courage tonic, noting how the medicine had transformed him from a shy, fearful child into a confident, outgoing boy. She had no idea that she was documenting her son's progression into alcoholism, interpreting his personality changes as medical improvements rather than symptoms of addiction. The systematic deception of caring parents represented something new in London's gin crisis. Previous phases had involved people who made conscious choices to drink, even if those choices were driven by desperation or despair. But the medicine programs created addicts who didn't know they were addicts, families who believed they were providing healthcare when they were actually destroying their children's futures. This deception was possible because most Londoners had no understanding of addiction as a medical condition. They recognized that some people drank too much and suffered consequences, but they interpreted this as a moral failing rather than a disease process. The idea that alcohol could create physical dependence was not part of popular understanding. Gin sellers exploited this ignorance ruthlessly. They presented addiction symptoms as evidence that their medicines were working. Withdrawal symptoms were described as signs that patients needed continued treatment. Increased tolerance was interpreted as proof that the medicine was helping the body fight disease more effectively. The medical marketing also provided cover for the gin sellers themselves, many of whom had started as legitimate merchants or tradespeople before being drawn into alcohol sales by economic necessity. They could tell themselves that they were providing genuine medical services rather than destroying communities for profit. But by 1731, even the most self-deceptive gin sellers were finding it difficult to ignore the obvious consequences of their business model. The neighborhoods where medicine programs had been most successful were also the neighborhoods showing the highest rates of family breakdown, child abandonment, and violent crime. Rebecca Morse, despite her success at building a gin empire, was beginning to experience personal consequences that made continued self-deception impossible. Her own children, who lived above her primary gin shop, had been exposed to alcohol fumes and spilled spirits throughout their childhood. They showed signs of developmental damage that even Rebecca could not attribute to other causes. Her eldest daughter, now 13, had developed seizure disorders that physicians attributed to chronic alcohol exposure. Her 10-year-old son showed learning difficulties and behavioral problems that made normal schooling impossible. Her youngest child, just 6 years old, had speech delays and motor coordination problems that suggested permanent brain damage. Rebecca's success at destroying other families had come at the cost of destroying her own. But like William and thousands of other people involved in London's gin trade, Rebecca found that moral clarity was a luxury she could no longer afford. Her business generated enough income to support not just her own addiction, but the addictions of dozens of employees who depended on her for their survival. Stopping gin sales would mean condemning her entire network to withdrawal, poverty, and likely death. Continuing meant perpetuating a cycle of destruction that was consuming London neighbourhood by neighbourhood, family by family, child by child. Rebecca chose continuation, as almost everyone in her position did. The immediate consequences of stopping seemed worse than the long-term consequences of continuing, especially when those long-term consequences could be rationalised, ignored, or blamed on other causes. But London's gin crisis was about to enter a new phase, one that would make the medicine programs and child recruitment efforts seem almost benign by comparison. Because the gin trade was about to discover that there were profits to be made not just from creating addicts, but from managing the process of their destruction. The year 1732 would bring innovations in human exploitation that would shock even those who thought they had seen the depths of gin's evil. And the government, which had remained largely silent about the crisis for more than 40 years, was about to face pressure that would force them to acknowledge what their policies had unleashed upon the people of London. The entrepreneurs of death had found their most profitable venture yet. By 1732, the gin merchants realized that managing human destruction could be more lucrative than simply causing it. They began opening what they called recovery houses, establishments that promised to help addicts overcome their dependence while actually ensuring their continued consumption until death. Meet Thomas Blackwood, brother to the gin seller Ruth we encountered earlier. Thomas had watched his sister's business flourish and wanted his own share of the profits, but he approached the trade from a different angle. Rather than simply selling gin to healthy people until they became sick, Thomas decided to target people who were already sick and charge premium prices for their inevitable deaths. Thomas opened his first recovery house in a large building on Thrall Street, advertising it as a place where desperate families could send their gin-addicted relatives for treatment. The marketing was brilliant in its deception. Thomas promised medical supervision, gradual reduction of alcohol consumption, and eventual restoration to productive life. The reality was far more sinister. Thomas had discovered that people in the final stages of gin addiction would pay extraordinary amounts for alcohol, far more than the standard street prices. A man dying from liver failure would trade his last possessions for one more drink. A woman suffering from withdrawal seizures would give Thomas anything he asked for in exchange for temporary relief. The recovery house provided the perfect environment for this exploitation. Families paid substantial fees up front, believing they were purchasing medical treatment for their loved ones. Once inside, patients found themselves entirely at Thomas's mercy, cut off from outside contact and dependent on him for every aspect of their survival. Thomas employed a staff of former addicts who understood exactly how to manage people in various stages of alcohol dependency. They knew how to provide just enough gin to prevent fatal withdrawal, while maintaining the psychological torture that made patients willing to surrender everything they owned for slightly larger doses. The patients, believing they were receiving medical treatment, interpreted their continued craving as evidence that they needed more intensive therapy. Thomas encouraged this interpretation, explaining that recovery required complete surrender of personal autonomy and material possessions to the treatment process. Within months, Thomas's recovery house was generating more profit per customer than traditional gin shops ever could. Each patient provided weeks or months of premium-priced alcohol sales, plus whatever belongings they had brought with them, plus ongoing fees from families who continued paying for treatment that would never succeed. But Thomas's most profitable discovery was that dying addicts could be made to serve the gin trade even in their final moments. Patients who were clearly approaching death were moved to ground floor rooms with windows facing the street, where passers-by could see them in their final agonies. These public death displays served multiple purposes. They attracted new customers who wanted to avoid ending up in similar conditions. driving them to seek treatment at Thomas's facility. They provided graphic warnings that made families more willing to pay higher fees for supposedly better care. Most cynically, they created a sense of urgency that made healthy people more likely to purchase gin as a way of enjoying life before it was too late. The death rooms became popular entertainment for Londoners, who had grown accustomed to public suffering. People would gather outside Thomas's windows to watch addicts in their final stages, making bets on how long each patient would survive and what their final words might be. Thomas charged admission for closer viewing, offering detailed explanations of how gin addiction progressed through various stages of physical and mental deterioration. He presented these tours as educational experiences that would help visitors avoid similar fates, while actually providing them with voyeuristic entertainment that normalized the very behaviors he claimed to be warning against. The success of Thomas's model inspired similar operations throughout London. By 1733, more than 50 recovery houses were operating across the city, each offering its own variation on the theme of profitable death management. Competition drove innovation in human exploitation, with different operators developing increasingly sophisticated methods for extracting maximum value from dying addicts. Some recovery houses specialized in wealthy clients, offering luxurious accommodations and personalized service, while ensuring that patients never actually recovered. Others focused on volume processing of poor addicts, cramming dozens of dying people into single rooms and charging families minimal fees for the privilege of having their relatives die indoors rather than in the streets. But perhaps the most innovative operator was Margaret Whitmore, a former midwife who combined recovery house operations with what she called family reunification services. Margaret's establishment on Drury Lane promised not just individual treatment but restoration of entire family units that had been destroyed by gin addiction. Margaret's marketing targeted the wives and children of male addicts, promising that her specialized treatment could return husbands and fathers to their proper roles as family providers and protectors. The emotional appeal was irresistible to families who had watched their loved ones disappear into gin-soaked oblivion. The reality of Margaret's operation was more horrifying than simple exploitation. She had discovered that addicted men could be made to perform labor while intoxicated, particularly work that required no skill or judgment. Margaret contracted with local manufacturers to provide workers for the most dangerous and degrading jobs available. Her male patients spent their days in workshops grinding metal, sorting through toxic waste, and performing other tasks that sober workers would refuse. The combination of dangerous work and constant intoxication meant that injuries were frequent and severe. But Margaret presented these injuries as part of the therapeutic process. She explained to families that their loved ones needed to experience the full consequences of their addiction before they could appreciate the value of sobriety. Cuts, burns, and broken bones were described as valuable learning experiences that would motivate patients to change their behavior. Meanwhile, Margaret's female patients were employed in what she called domestic rehabilitation programs. Women worked as servants in Margaret's establishment, cooking, cleaning, and caring for other patients while receiving their daily gin rations as wages. The work was presented as vocational training that would prepare them for employment after recovery. The domestic rehabilitation program had a darker purpose that became apparent only gradually. Margaret was training addicted women to serve as servants in the homes of London's wealthy, where their alcohol dependency would ensure absolute loyalty and discretion. Employers could treat gin-addicted servants however they wished, knowing that the servants' need for alcohol made them unlikely to seek other employment or report abuse. This created a steady stream of revenue for Margaret's operation. She charged wealthy families substantial fees for providing them with completely dependent servants, while also collecting the servants' wages as payment for continued gin supplies. The servants themselves received just enough alcohol to prevent withdrawal, ensuring their continued productivity while maximizing Margaret's profits. But Margaret's most profitable service was what she called grief counselling for families whose addicted relatives had died. She offered elaborate funeral services, memorial ceremonies, and ongoing support groups that helped families process their loss while gradually introducing them to gin consumption as a way of managing their emotional pain. The grief counselling programs were masterpieces of psychological manipulation. Margaret understood that families who had lost loved ones to gin addiction were often consumed by guilt, wondering if they could have done something different to prevent the tragedy. She exploited this guilt by suggesting that moderate gin consumption might have prevented the extreme behaviour that led to their relatives' deaths. Margaret's logic was seductive in its apparent reasonableness. She argued that people became addicted to gin because they tried to avoid it entirely, creating an all-or-nothing mentality that led to destructive binges when their willpower finally failed. The solution, she suggested, was controlled, medicinal use of gin that would prevent the psychological pressure that drove people to extremes. Grieving families, desperate for any explanation that might make sense of their loss, embraced Margaret's theories enthusiastically. They began incorporating small amounts of gin into their daily routines, telling themselves that they were preventing future addiction by learning to use alcohol responsibly. Of course, Margaret's theories were completely false. Controlled gin consumption was impossible for most people because gin's high alcohol content and addictive properties made moderation extremely difficult. But the families didn't understand this until they had already developed their own dependencies, at which point they became new customers for Margaret's various services. The cycle was perfectly designed for maximum profit extraction. Margaret created addicts through grief counselling, then offered them treatment through her recovery programs, then employed them as servants or labourers, then provided funeral services when they died, then counselled their families through grief programs that created new addicts. By 1734, Margaret's operation had expanded to include more than 300 people in various stages of this cycle. She owned multiple buildings, employed dozens of staff members, and had established relationships with manufacturers, wealthy families, and even some government officials who found her services useful for managing London's growing population of gin addicts. But Margaret's success attracted attention from competitors who wanted to replicate her integrated approach to addiction management. Soon, similar operations were appearing throughout London, each offering its own combination of treatment, employment, and death services designed to extract maximum value from human misery. The proliferation of these integrated gin businesses represented a new level of sophistication in London's addiction economy. These weren't just individual sellers trying to make money from desperate customers. They were complex organizations that managed every aspect of the addiction process, from initial recruitment through final disposal of bodies. Meet James Morrison, a former ship captain who established the largest integrated gin operation in London's history. Morrison's organisation controlled more than 20 buildings across the city, employed over 500 people, and processed thousands of addicts annually through what he called the complete life cycle management system. Morrison's system began with recruitment agents who identified potential customers in workplaces, churches, and community gatherings. These agents were trained to recognize the psychological vulnerabilities that made people susceptible to addiction, such as recent losses, financial stress, or social isolation. Once potential customers were identified, Morrison's agents introduced them to gin consumption through social activities that seemed completely innocent. They organized workplace celebrations, community festivals, and religious gatherings where gin was served as a special treat or ceremonial beverage. The social consumption programs were designed to normalize gin drinking among people who might otherwise resist alcohol marketing. When respected community members served gin at religious ceremonies or workplace celebrations, it gained a legitimacy that street sales could never achieve. Morrison understood that social pressure was far more effective than individual temptation at creating new addicts. People who might refuse gin from a street seller would accept it readily when offered by friends, neighbours, or religious leaders in social settings. Once people began consuming gin in social contexts, Morrison's agents gradually increased the frequency and intensity of these gatherings. Weekly workplace celebrations became daily afternoon breaks. Monthly religious ceremonies became weekly community meetings. Annual festivals became seasonal events that occurred every few weeks. The acceleration was so gradual that participants didn't notice they were consuming gin more frequently until they had already developed tolerance and physical dependence. By the time they realized what was happening, they needed Morrison's products to function normally in their daily lives. At this point, Morrison's system transitioned customers into the treatment phase of his operation. People who had become addicted through social consumption were offered enrollment in recovery programs that promised to help them regain control over their drinking while maintaining their social connections. The recovery programs were elaborate deceptions that actually increased addiction while appearing to provide medical treatment. Customers received what they believed were carefully measured therapeutic doses of alcohol, designed to gradually reduce their dependency over time. In reality, Morrison's staff gradually increased the alcohol content of these therapeutic doses, while telling customers that their tolerance was decreasing. Customers believed they were making progress towards sobriety when they were actually becoming more addicted with each passing day. The psychological manipulation was reinforced by group therapy sessions where customers shared their experiences and supported each other's recovery efforts. These sessions created strong social bonds between participants while normalizing continued alcohol consumption as part of the recovery process. Morrison's therapists were trained to interpret any sign of distress or discomfort as evidence that customers needed more intensive treatment, which invariably involved increased alcohol consumption. Customers who expressed doubts about the program were told that resistance to treatment was a common symptom of their addiction. The treatment phase could last for months or even years, during which customers paid substantial fees while actually becoming more addicted. Morrison maximized profits during this phase by offering various premium services, such as private therapy sessions, specialized medications, and exclusive social activities for customers who could afford higher fees. Eventually, customers progressed to the employment phase of Morrison's system. People who had become completely dependent on his organization for their alcohol supply were offered jobs within his various businesses, ostensibly as part of their rehabilitation process. These jobs included manufacturing gin in Morrison's distilleries, selling gin through his retail network, recruiting new customers for his social programs, and providing various services in his treatment facilities. Employees received their wages partially in gin, ensuring their continued dependence while reducing Morrison's labor costs. The employment phase served multiple purposes for Morrison's organization. It provided cheap labor for his various businesses, created a sales force that was completely loyal due to their addiction, and generated additional revenue from employees who often purchased supplementary gin beyond their wage allocations. Most importantly, the employment phase normalized the entire addiction process by presenting it as a legitimate career path. New recruits saw addicted employees who seemed to have stable lives and steady incomes, making addiction appear less dangerous than it actually was. Morrison's employees were trained to present themselves as success stories, people who had learned to manage their addiction productively rather than allowing it to destroy their lives. They spoke at community meetings, religious gatherings, and workplace events, sharing testimonials about how Morrison's programs had helped them find purpose and stability. These testimonials were powerful marketing tools because they came from people who genuinely believed they had benefited from Morrison's services. The employees weren't lying when they said their lives had improved since joining Morrison's organization, even though their improvement came at the cost of complete dependence and eventual destruction. The final phase of Morrison's system was death management, which he had refined beyond even Thomas Blackwood's innovations. Morrison's facilities included elaborate hospice operations, where customers spent their final months in relative comfort while continuing to purchase gin at premium prices. The hospice operations were marketed to families as compassionate end-of-life care that honoured the dignity of dying addicts, while providing them with whatever comfort was possible in their final days. The reality was that Morrison's staff expertly managed the dying process to maximise both profit extraction and marketing value. Dying customers were encouraged to dictate final testimonials about their experiences with Morrison's organisation. These testimonials, recorded by Morrison's staff and distributed to potential new customers, served as powerful warnings about the dangers of uncontrolled gin consumption, while simultaneously promoting Morrison's services as the best available option for managing addiction. The testimonials followed a standard format that Morrison's staff had perfected through years of experience. Dying customers acknowledged that their addiction had caused tremendous suffering, but they praised Morrison's organisation for providing them with dignity, community, and purpose during their final years. Most importantly, the testimonials included warnings to healthy people about the importance of seeking professional help if they ever began consuming gin regularly. These warnings directed listeners to Morrison's recruitment agents, who could provide information about his social consumption programs and early intervention services. Morrison's death management system even included elaborate funeral services that served as marketing events for his various programs. Funerals were well-attended community gatherings where Morrison's staff mingled with grieving families and friends, offering comfort, support, and information about services that might help them cope with their loss. The funeral marketing was particularly effective because it targeted people who were emotionally vulnerable and already predisposed to view Morrison's organisation favourably due to their positive experiences with the deceased customer. Morrison's staff were trained to identify people who showed signs of psychological distress and to offer them appropriate services from his comprehensive programme menu. By 1735, Morrison's complete life cycle management system was processing more than 2,000 people annually through its various phases. The operation generated enormous profits while maintaining a public reputation as a charitable organisation dedicated to helping London's most unfortunate residents. Morrison's success inspired imitators throughout England and even in other countries where gin consumption was becoming problematic. His business model was copied, adapted, and refined by entrepreneurs who recognized the profit potential in systematic addiction management. But Morrison's empire was built on a foundation that was inherently unstable. The system required a constant supply of new recruits to replace customers who died or became too damaged to generate profits. As London's population became increasingly addicted, the pool of potential new customers gradually shrank. More dangerously, Morrison's operations had become so large and visible that they were attracting attention from government officials who were finally beginning to understand the true scope of London's gin crisis. Parliamentary committees were being formed, investigations were being launched, and pressure was building for legislative action that might threaten the entire gin trade. The gin merchants had pushed their exploitation of human misery to levels that seemed impossible to exceed. They had created industrial systems for managing addiction, suffering, and death that generated profits beyond the wildest dreams of earlier entrepreneurs. But their very success was about to trigger a backlash that would threaten everything they had built. London in 1735 had become something unprecedented in human history, a major city where the systematic destruction of human beings had become the foundation of economic prosperity. Entire neighbourhoods existed solely to process people through cycles of addiction, exploitation, and death. Thousands of individuals earned their living by managing various aspects of human misery. The scale of the operation had reached proportions that made concealment impossible. Even casual observers could see that something extraordinary was happening in London, something that went far beyond ordinary social problems or economic hardship. Parish records showed that more people were dying than being born in large sections of the city. Tax records revealed that gin-related businesses were generating more revenue than traditional industries. Crime statistics indicated that violence had reached levels that threatened the basic functioning of civil society. But perhaps most importantly, the gin trade had begun affecting people and institutions that possessed the power to fight back. Members of Parliament were losing family members to addiction. Wealthy merchants were finding their businesses disrupted by gin-impaired workers. Military officers were discovering that gin-addicted soldiers were unreliable and dangerous. The gin merchants had achieved unprecedented success at extracting profits from human suffering. But that success had made them visible to enemies who possessed resources far greater than anything available to their previous victims. The reckoning, when it came, would be as systematic and ruthless as the exploitation that preceded it. But that reckoning was still months away. In the meantime, London continued its descent into depths of degradation that seemed to have no bottom, where children born into Morrison's system would never know any reality beyond managed addiction, where entire communities existed solely to serve the profit needs of gin merchants, where human life had been reduced to a commodity to be processed efficiently through industrial systems of destruction. The gin merchants had created a perfect machine for converting human beings into profits. But perfection, as they were about to discover, could be a dangerous thing when it attracted the attention of people who possessed the power to destroy it. The perfect machine was about to encounter its first serious obstacle. By early 1736, something unprecedented was happening in London's corridors of power. For the first time since the Distilling Act of 1690, members of Parliament were receiving complaints about gin not from moral reformers or religious leaders, but from their own constituents who possessed real political influence. Meet Sir Edmund Harrington, Member of Parliament for Westminster and owner of extensive properties throughout London. Sir Edmund had initially profited from the gin trade, collecting rents from buildings that housed distilleries and gin shops. But by 1736, those same properties were becoming liabilities that threatened his entire political career. Sir Edmund's tenants were no longer paying rent regularly because they were spending their money on gin instead of housing. His buildings were deteriorating rapidly because gin-soaked tenants had no interest in basic maintenance. Most seriously, the neighbourhoods around his properties had become so violent and chaotic that respectable families were moving away, leaving Sir Edmund with buildings he couldn't rent to anyone except gin sellers. But Sir Edmund's personal awakening to the gin crisis came through a family tragedy that made abstract policy concerns suddenly immediate and urgent. His younger brother Charles, a lieutenant in His Majesty's Navy, had returned from 3 years at sea to find London transformed beyond recognition. Charles Harrington had left England in 1733 as a promising young officer with excellent prospects for advancement. He returned in 1736 to discover that his fiancée, Miss Catherine Bowman, had disappeared into the gin-soaked underworld of St. Giles. Her family, once prosperous merchants, had been destroyed by addiction. Her father had sold the family business to buy gin. Her mother had died from alcohol poisoning. Catherine herself had become one of Morrison's employees, working in his hospice operations while slowly drinking herself to death. Charles found Catherine in a building on Monmouth Street, barely recognisable as the beautiful, intelligent woman he had planned to marry. She was 24 years old, but looked 40, her face gaunt and scarred, her hands shaking constantly, her speech slurred even when she hadn't been drinking recently. When Charles tried to convince her to leave with him, Catherine laughed bitterly and explained that she couldn't survive without Morrison's daily gin rations. Charles attempted to rescue Catherine by offering to pay Morrison whatever amount was necessary to release her from her employment contract. Morrison's response revealed the sophisticated legal framework that now protected the gin trade's most profitable operations. Morrison explained that Catherine wasn't technically an employee, but a patient receiving ongoing medical treatment for a chronic condition. Her work in his hospice was part of her therapeutic program, and interrupting that treatment would be medically dangerous. Moreover, Catherine had accumulated substantial debts for her treatment and housing that would need to be resolved before any change in her status could be considered. The debts, when Morrison presented them in carefully prepared documents, totaled more than £200, far more than Charles could afford on a naval officer's salary. But even if Charles could raise the money, Morrison explained, Catherine would need to consent to her own release, and her medical condition made her incapable of making rational decisions about her treatment. Charles discovered that Morrison's legal protections extended far beyond individual contracts. The gin merchant had cultivated relationships with magistrates, court officials, and even some judges who had come to see his operations as valuable social services that kept dangerous addicts off the streets. When Charles attempted to file legal complaints against Morrison, he found that the courts were reluctant to interfere with what appeared to be legitimate medical treatment. Morrison's facilities were clean, his patients were housed and fed, and his staff could produce impressive documentation showing that their methods were based on the latest medical theories about addiction treatment. The legal system's protection of Morrison's operations reflected a broader transformation in how London's authorities viewed the gin crisis. Rather than seeing it as a problem to be solved, many officials had begun treating it as a permanent condition to be managed. Businesses like Morrison's offered apparently humane ways of controlling a population that might otherwise become completely unmanageable. Charles's frustration with the legal system led him to consider more direct action. He gathered several fellow naval officers and planned to simply remove Catherine from Morrison's facility by force. But when they attempted to execute this plan, they discovered that Morrison's operations were protected by more than just legal documents. Morrison employed dozens of former soldiers and sailors who had become addicted to gin and found employment as guards and enforcers for his various businesses. These men were experienced fighters who understood violence in ways that most civilians did not. They were also completely loyal to Morrison because their continued access to gin depended on their effectiveness at protecting his operations. Charles and his friends found themselves outnumbered and outmatched by opponents who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from violent confrontation. The attempted rescue ended with Charles suffering a severe beating and being arrested by magistrates who viewed his actions as criminal assault on legitimate medical personnel. The arrest and trial of Lieutenant Charles Harrington became a sensation in London's newspapers and coffeehouses. Here was a decorated naval officer, brother to a member of Parliament, being prosecuted for trying to rescue his fiancée from what everyone could see was systematic exploitation disguised as medical treatment. Sir Edmund Harrington found himself in an impossible political position. Supporting his brother meant challenging businesses that generated substantial tax revenue and provided employment for thousands of London residents. But abandoning Charles meant accepting that the gin trade had become more powerful than the law itself. The trial revealed the extent to which London's legal and political systems had been compromised by gin money. Morrison's lawyers presented character witnesses who testified that their client was a respectable businessman, providing valuable services to the community. They produced medical experts who explained that Catherine's condition required ongoing treatment that only Morrison's specialized facilities could provide. Most damaging to Charles's case, she appeared in court clean and well-dressed. Speaking brought Catherine herself to testify, clearly and rationally about her gratitude for Morrison's care and her fear that her former fiancé's interference might disrupt treatment that was finally helping her overcome her addiction. Catherine's testimony was a masterpiece of coach performance. She acknowledged that she had once been severely addicted to gin, but she credited Morrison's programs with saving her life and giving her hope for eventual recovery. She expressed genuine affection for Charles, but explained that his misguided rescue attempt had endangered her progress toward sobriety. The court, had no way of knowing that Catherine had been carefully prepared for her testimony through a combination of increased gin rations and psychological manipulation. Morrison's staff had convinced her that cooperation with the legal proceedings was essential for her continued treatment, and that any deviation from their prepared script would result in immediate termination of her medical care. Charles was convicted of assault and sentenced to 6 months in prison, effectively ending his naval career and destroying his reputation. But his sacrifice achieved something that years of moral crusading had failed to accomplish. It made the gin crisis personal for people who possessed real political power. Sir Edmund Harrington emerged from his brother's trial determined to use his parliamentary influence to challenge the gin trade's legal protections. But he quickly discovered that Morrison's operations were just one part of a much larger network of businesses that had woven themselves into London's economic and political fabric. The gin trade by 1736 employed more than 50,000 people directly and supported perhaps twice that number in related industries. Distillers, sellers, transporters, guards, cleaners, builders, suppliers, and countless others depended on gin money for their survival. Any serious attempt to regulate the trade would create mass unemployment and economic disruption that could threaten the stability of the entire city. More importantly, the gin trade generated enormous tax revenues that the government had come to depend on for funding everything from military operations to public works projects. The profits from gin sales helped pay for the very naval ships that officers like Charles Harrington served aboard. Sir Edmund's investigation revealed that gin money had penetrated every level of London society. Parish officials received donations from gin merchants for charitable works. Church leaders accepted contributions for building repairs and social programs. Even some members of Parliament had financial interests in businesses that supplied or supported the gin trade. The corruption wasn't necessarily intentional or malicious. Many people who accepted gin money genuinely believed they were helping their communities by supporting businesses that provided employment and tax revenue. The gradual nature of the gin crisis had allowed people to rationalize their involvement by focusing on immediate benefits while ignoring long-term consequences. But by 1736, the long-term consequences were becoming impossible to ignore. London's death rates had reached levels not seen since the Great Plague. Crime statistics showed that violence had become endemic in large sections of the city. Economic productivity was declining as more workers became too addicted to perform their jobs effectively. Most alarming to government officials was evidence that the gin crisis was beginning to affect London's military capabilities. Naval recruitment was suffering because potential sailors were too damaged by alcohol to serve effectively. Army units stationed in London reported increasing problems with soldiers who purchased gin during their off-duty hours and became unreliable for combat operations. The military implications of widespread alcohol addiction became particularly apparent during a minor crisis with France in early 1736. When the government attempted to mobilize reserve forces for potential deployment, military commanders discovered that a significant percentage of their nominal strength was unavailable due to gin-related incapacity. Colonel William Thornton, commander of the London garrison, submitted a report to the War Office documenting the extent of alcohol-related problems among his troops. More than 30% of his soldiers were drinking gin regularly, despite military regulations prohibiting alcohol consumption during duty hours. Many had accumulated debts to gin sellers that made them vulnerable to coercion or blackmail. Most seriously, Colonel Thornton reported that several of his soldiers had been recruited by gin merchants to provide information about military activities and personnel. The merchants used this information to target military families for their various programs, knowing that soldiers' wives and children were often isolated and vulnerable to addiction marketing. The penetration of gin operations into military units represented a threat to national security that finally got the attention of senior government officials who had previously ignored the social and economic consequences of the gin crisis. Suddenly, the trade that had seemed like a useful source of tax revenue was looking like a potential threat to England's ability to defend itself. But even as evidence mounted about the gin trade's dangers, efforts to address the crisis faced enormous practical obstacles. The businesses that had grown up around gin sales were now too large and complex to be shut down quickly without creating economic chaos. Morrison's empire alone employed more than 500 people directly and had business relationships with hundreds of suppliers, contractors, and service providers. His operations generated substantial tax revenue, provided housing for thousands of addicts who might otherwise be homeless, and offered employment opportunities for people who were considered unemployable by traditional businesses. Shutting down Morrison's operations would require the government to find alternative solutions for all these functions. Where would displaced employees find work? How would the government replace the lost tax revenue? What would happen to the thousands of addicts who depended on Morrison's facilities for housing and medical care? Similar questions applied to every major gin operation in London. The trade had become so integrated into the city's economy that removing it would be like trying to perform surgery on a patient whose vital organs had been replaced with artificial devices. The operation might save the patient in the long run, but it could easily kill them in the process. The complexity of these challenges led to months of parliamentary debate and committee hearings that produced detailed documentation of the gin crisis, but no effective action to address it. Every proposed solution created new problems that seemed worse than the original situation. Some members of Parliament suggested gradual regulation that would slowly reduce gin production over a period of years. But gradual approaches had no chance of success against businesses that were specifically designed to create and maintain addiction. Any reduction in legal gin supplies would simply be offset by increased illegal production. Other lawmakers proposed immediate prohibition of gin sales, following the model used for other dangerous substances. But prohibition would require massive enforcement efforts that would be both expensive and politically unpopular. Moreover, the experience with other prohibited goods suggested that banning gin would simply drive the trade underground without eliminating it. The most radical proposals called for government takeover of gin production and distribution, allowing authorities to control the quality and quantity of alcohol available to consumers. But government operation of addiction businesses raised obvious moral and practical questions that made such proposals politically impossible. Parliamentary committees heard testimony from hundreds of witnesses representing every aspect of the gin trade and its consequences. Medical experts described the health effects of chronic alcohol consumption. Religious leaders discussed the moral implications of government-sponsored addiction. Military officers explained how gin was undermining national defense capabilities, but perhaps the most powerful testimony came from former addicts who had somehow managed to escape the gin trade's various programs and recover their sobriety. These individuals provided first-hand accounts of how businesses like Morrison's actually operated behind their facades of medical treatment and social service. Meet Robert Pemberton, a former customer of Morrison's complete life cycle management system, who had escaped after 3 years in various stages of the program. Robert's testimony to Parliament provided detailed documentation of how Morrison's operations actually functioned from the perspective of someone who had experienced them directly. Robert explained that he had first encountered Morrison's organisation through a workplace celebration in 1733. He was a successful carpenter, earning good wages and supporting a wife and 2 young children. The celebrations seemed innocent enough, just colleagues sharing drinks to mark the completion of a major construction project. But Robert noticed that the celebrations became more frequent over the following months, and that Morrison's agents were always present with high-quality gin that made the events more enjoyable than they would have been with ordinary beer or ale. The agents were friendly, generous people who seemed genuinely interested in the workers' welfare and happiness. Within 6 months, Robert found himself looking forward to these workplace celebrations as the highlight of his week. The gin made him feel confident, sociable, and temporarily free from the constant worries about money and family responsibilities that dominated his daily life. When the celebrations began happening several times per week, Robert didn't question the change. He was too grateful for the relief that gin provided to wonder why Morrison's agents were so generous with their expensive products. Robert's first indication that something was wrong came when he tried to skip one of the workplace celebrations to spend time with his family. He found himself restless, anxious, and unable to concentrate on anything except the gin he was missing. The feeling was so uncomfortable that he left his family and went to find the celebration, telling himself that he would just stay for one drink. By early 1734, Robert was experiencing physical withdrawal symptoms whenever he went more than a few hours without gin. His hands shook, he sweated profusely, and he sometimes saw things that weren't there. But Morrison's agents explained that these symptoms were signs of overwork and stress that could be managed through their specialized medical programs. Robert enrolled in Morrison's treatment program, believing that it would help him regain control over his drinking while maintaining his job and family relationships. The program's initial stages seemed beneficial, providing him with carefully measured doses of alcohol that eliminated his withdrawal symptoms while apparently reducing his overall consumption. But Robert gradually realized that the treatment program was actually increasing his dependence while creating the illusion of progress towards sobriety. The measured doses contained more alcohol than he had been consuming previously, but they were presented as therapeutic medications rather than recreational drinks. More insidiously, the program isolated Robert from his family and friends, while surrounding him with other addicts who reinforced each other's dependence. The group therapy sessions created strong social bonds between participants, but those bonds were based on shared addiction rather than healthy relationships. When Robert tried to leave the program after realizing what was happening, he discovered that Morrison's organization had taken control of every aspect of his life. His job had been transferred to one of Morrison's businesses. His family had been moved to housing owned by Morrison's associates. His debts for treatment had accumulated to amounts that would take years to repay. Most frighteningly, Robert found that his withdrawal symptoms had become so severe that attempting to quit drinking without medical supervision could be fatal. Morrison's staff used this medical reality to justify continuing his treatment indefinitely, explaining that premature termination of the program could kill him. Robert's escape from Morrison's system required elaborate planning and considerable luck. He managed to gradually reduce his alcohol consumption over several months by secretly disposing of portions of his daily rations. The process was agonizing, involving constant physical discomfort and psychological torment that nearly drove him to suicide. But Robert's military background had taught him discipline and endurance that enabled him to persist through withdrawal symptoms that defeated most of Morrison's other patients. When he finally felt strong enough to leave, he simply walked away from Morrison's facility and never returned. Robert's recovery required months of hiding from Morrison's agents who searched for him throughout London. He lived in church basements, abandoned buildings, and the homes of sympathetic friends who risked their own safety by harboring an escaped addict. Eventually, Robert managed to reunite with his family and find employment with a carpenter who was willing to hire someone with his history. But his escape was exceptional. Most of Morrison's patients never developed the physical strength or mental clarity necessary to attempt such a dangerous journey back to sobriety. Robert's parliamentary testimony provided the first detailed, first-hand account of how the gin trade's sophisticated operations actually functioned. His descriptions of Morrison's recruitment methods, treatment deceptions, and escape prevention techniques revealed a level of systematic exploitation that shocked even hardened politicians. But Robert's testimony also illustrated why legislative solutions would be so difficult to implement. Morrison's operations were technically legal, professionally managed, and apparently voluntary. Customers entered the programs willingly, signed contracts freely, and could theoretically leave at any time. The reality that these choices were made by people whose judgment had been impaired by addiction didn't invalidate the legal framework that protected Morrison's business. English law recognized no distinction between decisions made by sober individuals and those made by people under the influence of alcohol. Moreover, Morrison's programs provided genuine benefits that complicated any simple moral judgment about their operations. Addicts in Morrison's facilities were housed, fed, and given medical care that they couldn't obtain elsewhere. Many of them lived longer and suffered less than they would have on London's streets. The parliamentary committees found themselves facing an unprecedented legal and moral dilemma. How could they regulate businesses that were simultaneously providing valuable services and causing tremendous harm? How could they protect people who didn't want to be protected and might die if their access to alcohol was suddenly terminated? The complexity of these questions led to months of additional hearings, investigations, and debates that produced detailed documentation of the problem, but no effective solutions. Meanwhile, London's gin crisis continued accelerating toward a climax that would force Parliament's hand in ways that careful deliberation had failed to achieve. By late 1736, the gin trade had become so profitable and sophisticated that it was beginning to expand beyond London into other English cities. Morrison's model was being replicated in Bristol, Manchester, and even smaller towns, where local entrepreneurs saw opportunities to apply his systematic approach to addiction management. The spread of London-style gin operations to other parts of England finally convinced government officials that they were facing a national crisis rather than a local problem. The techniques that had been developed for exploiting London's urban poor were proving equally effective in rural communities and smaller cities. But the gin merchants had also made a crucial tactical error. Their success had made them overconfident, leading them to target increasingly powerful and well-connected victims. When Morrison's agents began recruiting from among the families of members of Parliament, military officers, and wealthy merchants, they created enemies with the resources and motivation to fight back effectively. The personal became political in ways that abstract policy concerns never could. When Sir Edmund Harrington's brother was destroyed by the gin trade, it stopped being someone else's problem and became a direct threat to people who controlled England's government. The reckoning was coming, and it would be as systematic and ruthless as the exploitation that had preceded it. But that reckoning would require methods that Parliament had never used before, targeting businesses that had grown too large and complex for conventional regulation to handle effectively. London, in late 1736, stood at a crossroads. The gin trade had achieved such complete penetration of the city's economy and society that it seemed impossible to remove without causing total collapse. But the alternative was accepting permanent transformation into something that no previous civilization had ever tolerated. A major city whose primary industry was the systematic destruction of its own population. The choice, when it finally came, would determine not just London's future, but the future of England itself. And the gin merchants, despite all their sophisticated planning and legal protections, were about to discover that there were limits to how far they could push human exploitation before triggering responses they couldn't control or survive. The perfect machine they had built for converting human misery into profit was about to encounter forces that would tear it apart with the same systematic efficiency they had used to construct it. But first, London would have to descend even deeper into the abyss, as the gin merchants made one final desperate attempt to maximize their profits before the inevitable reckoning arrived. The children of Gin Alley, now teenagers who had never known sobriety, were about to become the instruments of their own society's salvation in ways that no one could have predicted. And the mothers who had sold their babies for gin money were about to discover that some crimes create consequences that echo across generations, demanding payment in ways that the original perpetrators never imagined. The story of London's gin crisis was approaching its climax, and the resolution would be written in blood, fire, and the desperate fury of a population that had finally realised what had been done to them in the name of profit and progress. The story of London's gin nightmare doesn't end with the merchant's perfect machine for human destruction. It ends with the machine finally breaking under the weight of its own success. By 1737, Parliament could no longer ignore what gin had done to their city, their people, their very civilization. The Gin Act of 1736 tried to tax gin out of existence, but it only drove the trade underground and made the violence worse. It took years of brutal enforcement, riots in the streets, and thousands more deaths before London finally began to claw its way back from the abyss. The recovery was slow, painful, and incomplete. Entire neighbourhoods never fully recovered from what gin had done to them. Mary Jenkins, who sold her child for gin money, died in 1739 in a workhouse, her body so damaged by alcohol that she looked twice her age. Little Thomas Whitmore, the 8-year-old who learned the gin trade better than most adults, lived to see his 15th birthday, but no further. William Cartwright, the baker who lost everything to Rebecca Morse's empire, was found dead in an alley in 1738, clutching an empty gin bottle. These weren't just statistics. These were human beings whose lives were systematically destroyed by an industry that treated addiction as a business opportunity and human misery as a profit center. Their stories matter because they show us what happens when a society values economic growth over human welfare, when profit becomes more important than people. The gin crisis of 1700s London wasn't just about alcohol. It was about what happens when we allow the systematic exploitation of human vulnerability. It was about what happens when we normalize the destruction of families, communities, and entire generations in the name of commerce and progress. London survived its gin nightmare, but barely. The scars lasted for generations. The lessons, unfortunately, seem to have been forgotten. Because if you look around today, you might notice that we're still building machines for converting human suffering into profit. We're still finding ways to monetize addiction, desperation, and despair. The children of Gin Alley are gone, but their story remains. It's a warning written in the blood of innocence, a reminder that some prices are too high to pay, no matter how much money they might generate. Remember Mary Jenkins. Remember Thomas Whitmore. Remember what happens when we forget that behind every statistic is a human being who deserved better than what we gave them. The gin merchants thought they had built the perfect system. They were wrong. Perfect systems don't destroy themselves, but this one did, because it forgot the most important truth of all. You can't build lasting prosperity on the bones of your own people. Don't let history repeat itself. The next time someone tells you that human suffering is just the cost of doing business, remember London's gin-soaked streets. Remember the mothers who sold their babies. Remember the children who never had a chance. Remember, and make sure, it never happens again.